What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over the teams that I think are the top contenders to win the SEC this year. There's three that I think have the best shot, and there's one other team that always seems to be in contention that I'm also grouping with the other three teams. But before I reveal who those teams are and go in depth about them, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload as the college football season gets ready to get underway. But without further ado, let's get straight into things. And the first team on this list, I think they honestly fit a little bit better in the dark horse category. That's the Alabama Crimson Tide. They're coming off a 12-2 season, 8-0 SEC championship winning season. But obviously the big storyline is Kalen DeBoer replacing Nick Saban, the legendary head coach who took the Crimson Tide to heights that have rarely been seen by anybody, probably never seen before, aside from Bear Bryant in college football. DeBoer comes in. He's had a lot of success at various levels. At Sioux Falls, he did a really good job there. I think won a national championship or two. Then he stepped forward into the Washington position and did the same job with the Huskies, taking them to the national championship game and finishing as the runner-up. The question is he going to be able to have that same level of success at Alabama? This is the big job. It's probably the biggest job in college football. To help along with that, he's going to have a Heisman contender, Jalen Milroe, at quarterback. Threw for 2,800 yards, 23 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and added 531 rush yards and 12 touchdowns. Running backs Jam Miller and Justice Haynes are also experienced backs. And then Caden Proctor, the offensive lineman, had a little bit of a saga over the offseason with his transfer to Iowa and then decision to ultimately come back to Alabama. That was kind of a fiasco there, but he is going to be a valuable piece of the line as well. And also Tyler Brocker. The rush ranked 46th nationally, so not great, but still kind of in the top half of the country. They bring in Jeremy Bernard, a wide receiver for the Huskies last year, and tight end C.J. Dupree is also an option for Milroe to throw to. Defensively, they lose two key contributors, one to the draft and one to the transfer portal. Dallas Turner Jr., top 10 draft pick, was a stud for the Crimson Tide. They always seem, though, to be able to do a really good job of retooling. I mean, when Will Anderson was gone, kind of in that linebacker edge position, it was Turner who stepped up. Then, obviously, though, the freshman All-American last year, Caleb Downs, transfers to Ohio State, so that's a hole to fill in the secondary at free safety. Overall, they were a top 25 unit last year. Kane Womack is the new defensive coordinator coming in from South Alabama. He's going to work on kind of getting this team to adjust to a 4-2-5 adjustment. Leading the way in that are Deontay Lawson at linebacker and safety Malachi Moore. They also have 3 defensive linemen starters and a good addition from Texas A&M defensive lineman LT Overton. Cornerback Domani Jackson comes in from USC, and then safety Keon Sabb comes in from Michigan. Both of those guys got valuable experience at both of those places. For Alabama, their schedule is, I would say, reasonably difficult. They're at Wisconsin, which I think is a tough non-conference game to go into Camp Randall and play the Badgers. They're coming off a 7-6 season, but I think they will have growth under Luke Fickell in his, I believe, second season now in Madison. Then they have a bye, and then they host Georgia. That is a huge game. If they can pull what I think would be an upset, yes, they're at home, but I think the Dogs will be favored in that one. They really put themselves in a good position then. Then they're at Tennessee, home against Missouri, a bye week, and at LSU. Those 3 games come in 4 weeks, and then they're at Oklahoma late. This Crimson Tide team, I would project that they finish either 9-3 or 10-2. I'm a little undecided on which one of those they will finish. I think they can win a couple of those games on the road at Wisconsin. I think maybe they lose one or the other against Tennessee and LSU. I don't think they lose both, and probably the Georgia game. So I say Alabama finishes 9-3, but their schedule, I think, is good enough that they could still get into the college football playoff. And ultimately, that's the question they'll need to answer. But I think they do fall behind these other teams in the SEC race. Next up is the Ole Miss Rebels. They finished 11-2, 6-2 in conference. They bring back 14 starters, 7 offense, 5 on defense. And the question for the Rebels this year is, can they handle these expectations? They've never really had expectations like what they have going into this season from the outside. I think a lot of people tab them behind the next 2 teams on this list, Georgia and Texas. But I think they're right there, especially with their schedule, to have an opportunity to potentially make the SEC championship game. I think the Rebels have a really good team this year. I think Lane Kiffin has the pieces, made some additions in the transfer portal, had a big loss in the backfield, but I think this team is on the right path. Offensively, they ranked top 20 in a few key areas, 13th in total offense, 16th in scoring, 19th in passing. Jackson Dart, after transferring in from USC, threw for 3,364 yards, 23 touchdowns, and just 5 interceptions. He added almost 400 yards on the ground and 8 touchdowns as well. His first and third leading receivers are coming back last year. Trey Harris received almost 1,000 yards at 985 and 8 touchdowns. And then Jordan Watkins as well put up big numbers. In the backfield, they're going to need to replace Quinshon Judkins, who transfers to Ohio State. He had a really impressive yards per carry rate last year. But they don't have an empty cupboard there. Ulysses Bentley IV, one of the most proper names, I must say, in college football. Ulysses Bentley IV rushed for 540 yards and 4 touchdowns. They have 3 offensive linemen coming back to the team, and then they're also adding a couple of guards from Washington's Joe Moore Award-winning offensive line last year, Nate Kalepo and Julius Bulow. Defensively, they were 34th in scoring, so they did a good job of preventing opposing offenses from scoring for the most part. They had a really high-scoring game against LSU. I think that was more down to just both of those offenses being 2 of the best in college football and giving us quite the show last year. But then they ranked kind of the mid-60s to 70s elsewhere in the in the passing, rush, and total defense. So they were giving up a good amount of yards last year. They were able to lock down a little bit in the red zone. They did, though, under Pete Golding last year overall, improve from 25.5 points per game allowed in 2022 to just 22.1 last year. They're going to add defensive tackle Walter Nolan from Texas A&M, who had 11 tackles for loss for the Aggies last year, and then edge Princely Umanmielen from Florida. Those guys are going to be pairing with Jared Ivey. Linebacker Chris Paul Jr. comes in from Arkansas. Trey Amos, the cornerback, comes in from Alabama. And safety Yam Banks comes in from South Alabama. And then kind of the more experienced guy in that secondary is safety John Saunders. These Rebels, I talked about it kind of in the early part of going over them. They have a little bit of an easier schedule. They're at LSU, home against both Oklahoma and Georgia, and at Florida. They avoid Texas in this schedule. They avoid Alabama in this schedule. And I think getting 2 of those games, Oklahoma and Georgia at home, I could see them potentially pulling an upset of the Dogs. Again, kind of like Alabama, I think that Georgia will be favored going into Oxford. But I think if the Rebels win that game, I think they probably win the earlier game against Oklahoma at home. I think that game at LSU is tough, and I think they probably take care of business in the swamp near the end of the season. I think this Rebels team, my projection for them is finishing 11-1, and I think there is a strong chance. In fact, I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is, not literally, but I think the Ole Miss Rebels will be the team to get to the SEC championship game. And I'll get to who I think they're going to face next, but I think that will be key, the fact that they avoid Texas on their schedule this year. And speaking of Texas, those Longhorns went 12-2 last year, 8-1 in the Big 12. They were the conference champs last year. They make the move to the SEC. They bring back 13 starters, 5 on offense, 7 on defense. Starting with that defense, though, they were... it was a tale of 2 different parts of their defense. Their rush defense was among the best in college football, ranking 3rd in yards per game allowed. Their pass, however, ranked 113th. In that rushing attack, though, they're losing a couple of really good players, a couple of NFL draft picks in Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat. Losing both of those guys will be massive holes to fill. Kind of the keys to filling that will be defensive end Ethan Burke, and then defensive linemen Barron Sorrell and Alfred Collins. if those guys can plug in and do well, I think Texas will be back to that form of being able to stop the run this year. If they don't, then that could be a problem, again, because of their concerns in the secondary. At linebacker, they have the Big 12 Defensive Freshman of the Year, Anthony Hill Jr., who is kind of their emerging star. He pairs with David Gabenda. And then another guy who kind of is in that middle position between linebacker and being a DB is the star position, Jahdae Barron. In that back half of the defense, in that secondary, Malik Muhammad is a solid cornerback, and then they bring in safety Andrew Mukuba from Clemson. I think that's a solid addition. I would have liked probably to see Texas do a little bit more in the transfer portal to retool this defense and make the adjustments necessary, but I think their offense will make it so that they don't have to make a ton of stops. Talking about that offense, the question is, can they make the big plays that they made last year without A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy? Obviously, the speed of Worthy and just the big playability of A.D. Mitchell to get down the field and make the catch, either to get open to make the catch or even to make the catch in traffic. They were the number 9 offense in total yards per game, 15th in scoring, 17th passing, 24th rush. I think the answer to the question that I asked is yes. I think they will be able to make the big plays. Adding Isaiah Bond, obviously famous for the 4th and 31 play for Alabama against Auburn to win that game, to win the Iron Bowl, along with a couple of additions, Silas Bolden from Oregon State and Matthew Golden from Houston. Another question they're going to need to answer is, can they be better in the red zone? They were just 38.4% conversions on 4th down, 70th in college football last year, and they scored on just 50.8% of red zone trips, which ranked 120th. Quinn Ewers is an experienced quarterback. He threw for almost 3,500 yards last year, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and he's got a really experienced offensive line with 4 starters coming back. They're going to need to replace C.J. Baxter, a running back who suffered a season-ending injury, and so the question there is who's going to step up for him. Either way, kind of leading the way on that offensive line is going to be Kelvin Banks, who is kind of a first-round NFL draft-level talent. Their schedule is, I would say, manageable. They go to Michigan week 2 of the regular season. That'll be quite the showdown at the Big House. And then they host Oklahoma and Georgia back-to-back games, and they finish the regular season at Texas A&M. They face Oklahoma obviously in the Cotton Bowl. I think the Longhorns, I don't know, I see them getting to that Texas A&M game at 10-1. I just have a feeling that the Aggies might be able to pull an upset. I think those two teams facing off again for the first time in more than a decade, I think. That'll be huge. The Aggies will be amped up for that game. I think Texas will have to guard against it, and I'm sure they will. That comfortability of knowing that even if they lose that game, if they're sitting at 10-1, they're going to be in the college football playoff with it expanding to 12 teams. But I don't know. It's an early prediction to make that sort of call of a game, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were to be upset late, and I think that would open the door for Ole Miss. I could also see them potentially losing to Oklahoma and then Georgia as well being their second loss. But speaking of those Bulldogs now, the team that is not only the favorite in the SEC, but also to win the national championship, they've got 17 starters coming back, 9 on offense, 6 on defense. And they have also kind of a big influx of talent coming in with 33 newcomers to the team. 13-1, 8-0 last year, the SEC runner-up, losing to Alabama. Carson Beck, I think, kind of flies under the radar a little bit just because of how good the Georgia defense is. I think he's started to receive more of the hype that he deserves and the plaudits. He threw for almost 4,000 yards last year, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. The guys that he's going to be throwing to are going to need to replace the production of Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, among others. But wide receiver Dominic Lovett and then Oscar Delp is going to need to be Bowers' replacement. At running back, an emerging star there is Roderick Robinson II, and then a big pickup from the rival Gators is Trevor Etienne, who is their top newcomer. 4 offensive linemen are returning to the Bulldogs this year, which will also be huge. And so I think you can expect the Georgia offense to continue to put up the production they did last year. Defensively, mentioned them, top 10 unit, 5th in scoring defense, 18th against the rush, 9th in both passing and total defense. Defensive end, kind of at each of the 3 levels, defensive end Mykel Williams, linebacker CJ Allen, and free safety Malachi Starks are the key players to watch. At cornerback, Dalen Everett is the player to watch there, and they've also got a 5-star incoming freshman, Ellis Robinson IV, who should be able to plug right away into this Georgia defense. Even if he doesn't start, or maybe if he starts in the slot, I think he'll be a key player as well. After those 2 guys, the secondary does have some questions. Some of the other guys that they'll look to are KJ Bolden and Ja'Cory Thomas. And then one other thing on the defensive side of the ball, mentioned Mykel Williams. He's kind of making a little bit of a move to more of an outside linebacker role, kind of dropping back into coverage from that defensive end position. So that'll be something to keep an eye on for the Dogs as well. Their schedule is pretty loaded. It's not like incredibly difficult, but they face the teams that I think are the top contenders in the SEC right behind them. And they also have a neutral site game to open the season against Clemson in Atlanta. Then they've got Alabama on the road, and then Texas on the road, and then a 3-week stretch back-to-back games of Florida in Jacksonville, obviously a rivalry game, at Ole Miss November 9th, and home against Tennessee November 16th. I think the Bulldogs have the team necessary to be able to get those wins. I think they have a lot of depth. Even though they lost a lot of players to the transfer portal, like I said, they're bringing a lot of newcomers in. So Georgia, my projection for them is to finish 11-1. So that means I have Georgia and Ole Miss meeting up for the SEC championship, and I have Texas right behind them, probably finishing the regular season at 10-2. But I think they're a dangerous team to watch. I think they'll start clicking. Maybe if they do lose that game to A&M, it could wake them up just in time for the playoffs. But I'm going to go into and reveal who I think will win the SEC championship game in my next video, which I'm hoping to get out kind of middle of next week, right before the regular season starts. I'm going to be going over who I think is going to be the conference champions, teams from each conference who I think are going to be in playoff contention, and then I'll also be revealing my bracket, and finally, my official final college football playoff projections all the way to who I think will be lifting that national championship trophy. But thank you so much if you stuck around to this point in the video. Let me know your thoughts below on who you think are the top contenders in the SEC. I had a video going over the dark horse teams. Let me know if you think either one of those dark horse teams should have been on this list or one of these teams should have been on that list. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett, signing out. Peace.